Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Leslie Huxley, Director of Membership and Organisational Development at the Leadership Foundation, and it's my pleasure to chair this second keynote of the morning, which is a keynote in, I can't say 4 halves, but 4 parts. 4-part harmony, I hope, which is on the changing nature of university leadership and the implications for development practitioners. So we're going to have 4 speakers, each providing a short, maximum 15-minute response to that topic, and we're going to do them back to back, 4 in a row. Then there'll be a quick 5 minutes around your tables just to reflect on what you've heard, and then we'll take a Q&A to members of the panel after that, just before lunch. So I'm not going to do any lengthy introductions because we've got speaker biogs in your packs, and the speakers themselves will introduce themselves as part of their presentations. I have got some fairly ruthless 5-minute, 2-minute and stop warnings, which I shall be applying. And if that fails, then may need to be a hook to get people off the platform. And hopefully you'll have an opportunity to follow up on what I hope will be a very stimulating set of talks over the next hour or so. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mike Munro-Turner, Mike the Mentor, as he's known, to talk about the dynamics of self-leadership. Mike, over to you.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about really what's coming down the track in terms of leadership. I'm an executive coach. I work through the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education and on my own account, and I'm very interested in how to help people develop the capacities to be able to lead in this sort of changing world. I hope also that because we all fulfill leadership roles, not just at work, but in other situations and places as well, in our families, in our communities, that this will be of interest in that context as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by looking at what the context in which leadership is happening at the moment, what that is. I'm then going to provide a map or a framework for thinking about what leaders need to be able to do in response to this context. And then I'm going to briefly look at the end at the implications for you as development practitioners. So I think probably quite a lot of you will have come across the phrase VUCA. Now this isn't working. So we go. This is a phrase that actually, was a mnemonic that goes back 20 years or so to the aftermath of the Cold War. It was developed by the US Army as a way of describing the new reality, where they'd gone from this very binary system of the Cold War into a much more complex, ambiguous, uncertain, volatile world. And it's a mnemonic that's been cropping up increasingly in the leadership and organizational world. And it's in distinction to what we kind of thought the world was before: stable, predictable, simple or complicated, as opposed to complex, and clear. And if you think the world is like those right-hand bullets, then you can sort of respond to it by seeking to predict and plan and aim to control your organizations. But if you believe that the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, then predicting and planning and controlling no longer works. You need an approach which is more like sense and respond. And there's really, I suppose, 2 broad areas or 2 broad ways in which you can deal with this situation. One is from a social psychology perspective, if you like, where you recognize that behavior is influenced by the context in which it happens. so organizational design. If you haven't read this book, Reinventing Organizations, please do. It's an extraordinary book. It's been written by a guy called Frederick Laloux, who's an ex-McKinsey consultant. And what he's done is he's looked at next stage organizations across a number of sectors. He's looked at ones in the energy sector, the health sector, food processing, manufacturing, none actually in HE, but a school in Germany. And he's looked to see what the shared principles that these next stage organizations embody. And there are three key elements. Self-management. So these organizations do not have management hierarchies. They have management, but it's distributed through the people. So I thought Darren's video was very interesting, that was very much moving in that kind of direction. They also have evolutionary purpose. So the organization itself has a purpose. This is not the purpose of the chief exec or the shareholders or the board or whatever. The organization itself has a purpose. And one of the jobs of the people in the organization is to help discern what the purpose is that's seeking to evolve and help the organization move towards that. And thirdly, they have this principle of wholeness, that people are encouraged to bring more of themselves, or indeed all of themselves, to work, rather than leaving a fair chunk of themselves at the door. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, though, but do please read the book. It's a stunning read. I'm going to look more from the point of view of the individual, maybe the individual psychology, and look at the development of the individual leader. So what is it that leaders do? Well, this is a very simple model, but what they do is they see what's going on, they make sense of it, they create a vision of how things could be different, and they take action to make that happen. Now, the two ones at the bottom, seeing what's going on and making sense of it, are focused on the present. And the two at the top, imagining a future state and taking action to bring that into being, are future-oriented. The two down the right-hand side, taking action and seeing what's going on, are focused externally, and the two on the left are focused internally. So we can see that this kind of maps out, if you like, a territory of leadership. And whilst this is a very simple high-level model, operating in any one of those quadrants takes a lot of skill and a lot of complexity, even in a more stable, certain world. But what I want to look at is what leaders now need to be able to do differently or in addition in response to a VUCA world. So, at that higher level, they still do what they were doing before. They need to see what's going on. They need to be able to make sense of it. They need to imagine a future that's worth moving towards. And they need to take action to bring that future into being. And that, is through things like talking, like role modeling, and so forth. So let's look at each of these in a bit more detail. So why is it difficult to see what's going on? You might just say, well, you look and you see. But in a world that's volatile, that's uncertain, that's complex, that's ambiguous, that's far from easy to do. We tend to see, we all do this, we tend to see what we expect to see. We also have something called the confirmation bias. We look for things that support our beliefs, our point of view. So we also like things to be as simple as possible. It's easier to see, that's all that's going on, rather than to imagine it as being more complex. And also, we are intrinsically lazy. It's quite hard work to continuously pay attention. It's very easy for our minds to wander. And so it's easier for us to miss what's going on. So some of the things that leaders now need to do is they need to be able to ask different questions, different kinds of questions. I was with somebody in London on Tuesday coaching them, and their boss only ever asked questions about why haven't you done this, or what is it you're going to do next. He never asked questions about what are the opportunities that you could be pursuing at the moment. I'm sure you notice with other people around you, I'm sure you don't do this, but with other people around you, that they tend to have particular sorts of questions that they ask, and that tends to lead to them getting particular answers. So learning to ask different questions is really important. And then being able to listen to what's coming back. Because very often we ask questions with the intention of getting our own views confirmed. I did some work in a consultancy some years ago, and we were talking about listening. And the person I was talking to said, oh, people around here don't listen, they just reload. We also need to take multiple perspectives. We need to be interested in what other people are seeing that we're not seeing. We need to be able to see systems. We tend to see things as being discrete, separate objects or people or whatever. We need to be able to see the patterns of relationship between them. We need to be reflective, and we also need to be reflexive, see our part in what happens. We need to make sense of what's happening next. And that's difficult because we have habitual ways of thinking. We need to find ways of bringing more resources to bear. So we need to be able to use heart and gut. Darren mentioned that. Heart and gut are valuable sources of information which are often not really acceptable in organizations. But we need to bring those because intuition, for example, is a way of dealing with complex information and being able to see patterns and essences that a linear way of thinking won't give us. We need to be able to recognize when we've climbed up the ladder of inference and jumped to conclusions that are not valid. We need to be able to go down and see what the data was, what the meaning we added was. We need to manage regressions, mental models, and traps. So for me, standing here, feeling slightly anxious and thinking, ooh, how's this going? It's quite easy for me to get controlled by that anxiety. So one of the things we need to be able to do is to distance ourselves from what we're feeling. And we need to be able to maintain or manage paradox and polarities rather than collapsing them, because the nature of the world is ambiguous. And if we collapse paradoxes, then we're not engaging with what's actually happening. Going up to the top left-hand corner, staying with an inner focus here, the challenge in imagining a compelling, sustainable future is we don't know what the future is. It is intrinsically uncertain. And because we can't predict it, what we need to do more is sense it and then have a meaningful purpose that motivates us and those who follow us to move towards that purpose and that vision. So a metaphor here is riding a wave. If you're a surfer, you try and anticipate what the wave is doing, how it's moving, but at the same time, you have your intention, your goal in terms of how you're going to ride the wave. So it's that combination of intention and responding to the environment. And then finally, we need as leaders to be able to bring that vision into being. And this is difficult because we can feel very vulnerable as leaders. We can feel very exposed. And we also have our habitual ways of being. So, yes, we need to be able to catalyze change in the workplace. We also need to be role models. Again, that was something that Darren spoke about. We need to show the way. We're held to higher standards as leaders in terms of the kind of behavior that we show. So it's important to be able to be ourselves, to be authentic, but we have to do that with skill and flexibility. And the other thing, or another thing we have to do, is to be experimental in the way we act. Because the future is so much less predictable, and because we're interacting with complex systems, we need to be able to try things out which will fail safe, so that if they go wrong, they don't create a lot of damage, as a way of interrogating the world we're operating in. And there's a fifth thing that I think leaders need to be able to do, which is implicit in what I've been saying in each of these 4 territories. And that is to be more mindful, to be able to use themselves from a centered place, to be able to mobilize the resources they have, the ability to see what's going on, the ability to draw on their thinking, their feeling, their intuition, their ability to imagine a different future, and their ability to act beyond their habits, to bring all of this into being. Oh, wrong button. So, to conclude, firstly, leadership is very different in a VUCA world. It's more complex, and it calls on the individual leaders to make a journey and to use not just what's happening out here, but what's going on inside them as instruments of that leadership. So it takes time and it takes commitment to develop that. So I think your role here is firstly to educate leaders into this reality that things have changed. It's secondly then to provide the support to them to help them exist in this space when there will be a pull back, a kind of psychological pull back to behaving as they've always behaved. And thirdly, for you yourselves to be modeling to other leaders in your organizations these new leadership behaviors. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And I'd like to hand over straight away to Julian Chowdhury now from the University of Bradford. You've got the clicker thing? Yep. Excellent.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you. I'm a little bit nervous because this is not a scientific conference, which I'd normally be addressing. I'm here to talk about leadership in universities, and you guys, I think, are the experts, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I've discovered along the way of my journey. My background is I'm at the University of Bradford. I took up the position of Dean of a recently merged faculty about 2 years ago. But before that, I was at the University of Bath, just down the road, where I actually worked quite closely with Angie and Simon, who are in the team there. So Angie, when developing the speakers for the conference, said, I wonder if you'd be in the area in November, because colleagues might like to hear about the journey that you've made and what you've been doing from a very pragmatic, gut feeling point of view, I think. So what I'm going to do is to talk about, and hopefully answer these 3 questions in some ways from my personal experience. And I think these are in the brochure, and they're general questions that perhaps every one of you is dealing with in your organisations. My focus, though, on academic leadership is not about the Vice-Chancellor level. It's actually much more pragmatic. I think universities run very smoothly when you've actually got a succession planning of academics who want to take up roles within their departments and faculties. And the problems come, I think it was Darren, I'm not sure if Darren's left, but one of his comments really resonated, which was about changing people's roles. Now, as an ex-head of department and now a dean, trying to get somebody to say, can you not teach that course anymore? You've taught it for 15 years and the overheads are now a bit grey and it's faded. And I say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, we still do have steam engines, don't we? No. There are people who really like to stick with what they're doing, but universities will not progress unless people are actually changing through their roles. So how do we get them to do that? And so my focus is very much for academic leadership within the remit of people who you want to be good heads of departments and maybe beyond that. And how can we help them to do that, and what kind of people want to do it. So my three topics, really, my personal journey, and I apologise if it's a little bit indulgent, but it might just be useful to give you a real life example of someone who's maybe slowly making it. Then what I learned as a head of department, I was head of department for 6 years at Bath, in a department that was at the bottom of the NSS when I took over, and last year was top, just after I left, damn it. So my old boss said, you left too soon, someone else is getting all the medals, but never mind, I'll tell you how we did it. And then I was Associate Dean at Bath at the same time as being head of department, partly because I'm stubborn and a fool, but also it was actually a good learning. And so what am I learning now as a Dean? So very briefly, and this is not meant to be a recounting of my whole career about how I've done that, how I've done everything, but just to give you some examples of the things that I've done that have helped shape me and get me the roles I think I've got now. It's a 25-year timeline. I'm not going to go through every year. I started... You'll be asleep by then, or Les going to kill me. I started my career at the University of Birmingham as a lecturer in 1989. The graph starts from 1990. I went to Bath in 91, and then I'll tell you the story. So, I'm a scientist. I had to have a graph. And Excel doesn't do graphs for careers, so I've just botched something. So ignore the numbers on the left. It's just to give a bit of spectrum. Anyway, that's when my career kind of, in terms of the promotions that I've had. So I was a lecturer at Birmingham and at Bath, became senior lecturer and then reader and then professor in 2004, which is the position I hold at the moment. And I'll explain the other dots because they might just give you some context as to how that came about. So I think I've done a fairly holistic job as an academic. I've always taught, up until I went to Bradford as Dean, I've always taught pretty much a full teaching load, so that's something I think is very important for all academics to do. And I've had, I think, a moderately successful research career. I don't think I've got a chair at Bath, and those people at Bath who know how promotions work at Bath, it's quite, still quite hard to do that. So I've had a moderately good research career. But I've taken on roles within the department as they came up. So I was Director of Studies for 4 years, which is probably the second biggest job in a department, organising all the teaching and the quality of teaching, etc. I became head of department in about 2007, became associate and stayed as head of department until I left Bath, and associate dean at the same time to take us through REF. And you might say, why did I do it? And there's lots of other little jobs I've done along this that that I've just not put on the graph, but international officer, MSc coordinator, all the things that make a department run. The bits in green, which I haven't got the symbols for, are some of the research highlights. So over here, when I started at Birmingham, I won an ICI Royal Academy of Engineering Fellowship for 5 years, which was quite prestigious, and that helped me give me a bit of uplift. And then I've started 2 research centres at Bath. The one in the middle was a research centre I started in the area of research I was doing at the time around enzymology. I should have said I'm a chemical engineer by training in research. And then the third green line is a centre for regenerative medicine that I co-founded at Bath. So I've managed to do research and keep some of the, if you like, leadership and admin jobs going. Now you might say to me, why have I done all this? Well, partly we were a small department, so there was like Buggins' turn that people were expected to do it. But I also kind of knew that if you wanted to move on and move further, you had to have experience in various roles in order to have a CV that made you feel you'd do that. Actually, the head of department one was a bit of a joke. I knew it was my turn. And I thought, well, if I don't enjoy it, I've only got to do it for 3 years, and if I'm bad at it, they'll take it away. And sadly, I did enjoy it, and the department did flourish a bit, and so I ended up being a dean somewhere. So that's my story. But what have I learned as head of department? And I think this is the most important thing I would say to anybody here today. And maybe it's outside of your control and remit, but I think the biggest issue is recruitment. And it's a very trite thing to say that the problems in an organisation are caused by bad recruitment, but I think in universities it's the case. And certainly in my department in Bath, there were academics that were recruited who shouldn't have been recruited. And certainly I've inherited a big faculty where people have gone into lectureships and academic jobs without the degree of scrutiny that I would put on it. So recruiting academics and making sure that they're fully aware of what they're going into, and it's a partnership between the university and them, is key. And I I implemented, and HR probably weren't very happy with me doing this at Bath, I implemented a different way of recruiting, which is very much based on the US academic model of recruiting, which is you get people in for 2 or 3 days and you scrutinise them and they scrutinise you. And by the time they've left, you've seen them warts and all and they've seen you warts and all. And then if they decide that you want to make them an offer and they come, there's no hidden bits and pieces. I'm doing that at Bradford now. So recruitment is key, and this is the bit that I think is I'm not saying holy triangle, that's the wrong metaphor, I forget metaphors. This is the thing that people were really sceptical about. I said, this is what we want to do. I want to do as a head of department. I want a world-class researcher. I want somebody who wants to be a professor on the basis of their research. And remember, the universities have changed, even in my career, that when I started, there was 1 professor in chemical engineering at Bath. There's about 5 now. Anyone can become a professor. It's no longer dead men and women's shoes. So I want a world-class researcher. We needed inspirational teachers, people who really did want to teach students and inspire them and be with them and do that. And thirdly, the glue. I needed good colleagues. This is the bad behaviour bit. I wanted people who actually would do everything and do their part. And I was told, you're never going to get those people. It won't happen. We pursued. We didn't appoint. If we didn't meet the right people, we went around the cycle several times, but we did get a number of people. And I'm not going to mention names, and I'm not going to embarrass any people. Angie will know some people on the slide. But these were the 8 people that I recruited in a department of 17 or 18. So we had some churn. And I would say each one of those 8 people has all the attributes in that triangle. They were hard to find, but they were really good people. Some of them have probably been at Bath 7 or 8 years, some only 2 or 3. But just to pick out some highlights, there's a person there who will be a professor within 6 months. Their career is going stunningly, and they're also director of research for the department. There's somebody there who's now director of teaching and is being lined up to be an associate dean in the next 2 to 3 years. There's people there with fantastic research records. Pretty much, I will point out one person here because it's stunning. John on the top right here won the university's most prestigious teaching award in his 2nd year of being an academic. So a really inspirational lecturer, but also a fantastic researcher. And one of the colleagues there has been poached by Cambridge because they're that good. So those people do exist. Bath is lucky, it's a good university in a good location, we can attract them. I'm trying to do the same thing in Bradford now, and it's challenging, but it's about getting the right people in. Now, these people, what's so good about them, and I've got a summary slide later that might explain it, but all of those people have had some degree of, and I use coaching in the broadest sense, it's some coaching, some mentoring, about developing trust, about finding out what they want to do and supporting them. And that's been done at a very personal level. They've not just been brought in and said, okay, young man or young woman, you're in the deep end, off you go. Because academics, you may know this, academics, although they're difficult, they're arrogant, they think they know everything, they're actually very insecure. And when you recruit academics, and the academic job is very much on day one, it's your job, pal, you want to be a professor, off you go. But people do need to be shown the way and the route to go. So coaching, mentoring has been crucial. Then I took on the role of Associate Dean, and that brought in a bigger focus. So I'm lumping together here my experiences as being Associate Dean at Bath and now Dean of a full faculty at Bradford. And what I've now picked up is that there are even differences between disciplines, even within a faculty of engineering. So how I expected the chemical engineers in my department to behave and their careers to develop and how I expected them to be independent, that's now been slightly changed when you go into other disciplines. And the difference I'm saying is that chemical engineers are very much like scientists. Most scientists and academics you work with will be principal investigators. They'll want their own lab, their own empire. They want to be the person. Chemical engineers are quite like that. Other engineers, actually are quite happy to join other groups and to be perhaps a cog in a machine, and eventually they will rise to the top. And so that's been quite hard for me to learn that there are differences between disciplines in a university. I think setting expectations is key, and I think, again, it alludes to a bit what Darren was saying. I'm personally not good at having difficult conversations early enough where problems arise, and I'm trying to get better at that. But I think I'm good at setting expectations of what I think should happen. And because we had a problem with the NSS in the department, setting expectations of performance and teaching performance was crucial. And there's a lot about transparency. So setting expectation that good teaching is the norm, and being fair and consistent with everyone in the faculty or the department. So just because someone's come in who's very new doesn't mean they should be held up with their career developing. If there's an old codger who's been around for 20 years and still having coffee 3 times a day in the senior common room, the younger people are spotting that and they're saying, well, why should I be held back just because they haven't been promoted? So it's about being consistent and fair. Transparency is important, and I think that's just obvious. I won't say any more about that. As time's pushing on, I want to really tell you about one thing I've done to kind of grow the talent pool. And it was an initiative that I started in the Faculty of Engineering at Bath with a colleague of Simon and Angie's, who supported me from staff development point of view. We set up what's called the Faculty Fellowship Academy. The main idea being, why should we spend all this trouble recruiting academics in? Why can't we grow them ourselves and keep them? Or even being a bit altruistic, saying actually put them back into the system and allow other universities to benefit. So what we did, we got academics to identify their final year PhD students or good postdocs who are exceptional, who are elite. And I can be very controversial now and say that actually when I did my PhD, when fewer people did PhDs, every PhD student actually was in that bracket. But now, as universities are required to take more PhD students, there's more diversity amongst the PhD population, especially in terms of aspirations. But we picked those students, and we did some very simple application forms to see why they wanted to be an academic and what they wanted to do. And small cohorts, 8 to 10 students every 2 years we did this. And what we did was a training and needs analysis and developed a personal development plan. We wanted to fast track them to becoming really competitive to get a lectureship or a fellowship. We signed a mentor outside of their department, away from their supervisors, so they could actually offload and get some proper development. We ran a number of workshops to support them. Simple things, time management, creative thinking, writing a fellowship, presentation skills, where we actually videoed them and showed it back to them, and they all cringed, but by the second or third time we've done it, they're actually getting better. And then the key bit actually was the peer support. We encouraged them to be a cohort, to work together, to criticise each other's research ideas, to talk about where their applications were going and their interviews. And we also provided academic support for their fellowship proposals, so to listen to their ideas, help refine the ideas at an early stage. And again, there was some success with that. A number of those staff have been kept on as lecturers at Bath, some have got fellowships, some have gone to other universities. And this scheme has now been extended to the science faculty in Bath, and again, it's something that we'll be doing in Bradford. So just to end up with, in terms of these leaders that we want, what kind of people do we need? What kind of people are they? And I think all the people on my slide of 8, they could all become heads, departments, deans if they wanted to, not become senior researchers. Well, they've got to have innate talent, but you wouldn't take on people without that anyway. I think they've got to be hardworking because the job is difficult. They need to have shown some success, and that's hopefully the environment that you provide will allow them to have that. But the key thing I would say is that all of those 8, I know, because I've talked to them all, I've worked with them closely, are all quite reflective. They want to be developed. They want to find better ways of be better academics and people. They will go on the workshops that Simon and Angie ran, and they wouldn't feel they'd been dragged there. And even now I've left, they're still ringing me up and asking my advice. And I think that's the key bit. You've got to find people who actually want to be developed and are willing to go on that journey with you. So finally, main conclusions. I think recruitment is key. Do not underestimate that. It's so important. The leadership challenges have changed immensely in HE, and even my career. You know, everyone's expected to do more with less, and etc. etc. You know this as well as I do. I think having the support with coaches, role models, staff development, HR is crucial. University promotion criteria have to be clear, or else people will measure themselves against that. And then it's a question for you. Does anyone here do succession planning well? I'm not sure. So I'll stop there, and I'll stay around for lunch this afternoon. Very happy to talk to people individually, but I know we've got the panel interview anyway.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Julian. I'm going to hand over now to Richard Bolden. If I can find his... Right, over to you then, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think my contribution here is largely based on research that we've done over a number of years, particularly for the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education. And of course, in my own role and journey as an academic, that's kind of run alongside that as well. So I'm trying to get the wire out of the way at the same time. So in reflecting on this question about the changing nature of university leadership and the implications for development practitioners, I'm going to encourage us to think a bit about the wider cultures. We've talked about some of the issues for individuals. I've got to move it up a bit further. Some of the issues for individual leaders and what they want to look for. So we're saying, how might we build the wider culture where leadership is a shared expertise? So is this the right thing? So just to kind of flag up, again, the point's been well made, I think, this morning. Mike mentioned the VUCA context. There's an awful lot's been going on in higher education, and is still going on in higher education. It's a fundamental period of change around competition for students, about the expectations around the provision that we provide to students, about our campuses, about our need to work and genuinely collaborate in partnerships with different types of organisations and different types of people. We're constantly kind of measured against lots of metrics and rankings and so on. And a kind of increasing professionalisation, as I suppose, reflected by the existence of this sort of conference and this sort of community as well. So what does all of that mean? And I suppose I'm going to draw here mainly on a piece of work that myself and colleagues, when I was at Exeter at that point, did for the Leadership Foundation, published it a number of years ago, and which is now summarised in a report that's just hot off the press that you can get from the NFHE stand outside as well. And I just thought I'd begin with this, and this is kind of, I suppose, the depressing slide. This is a bit of the research that we didn't tend to talk about that much, but I think it's very important. So what happens in that context of uncertainty, change, unpredictability, VUCA, I think sums it up well. Well, we run a number of listening posts with academics from across different institutions. Again, this was at the time when they were bringing in and making the decisions about the change to undergraduate fees. And people described and actually genuinely appreciated the opportunity to talk about and share some of these feelings that they had. A sense of kind of ambiguity about their experience of the job and their institution. So kind of a bit of a love-hate relationship, often quite difficult, you're torn. There were certain particular groups, but many people felt a bit kind of vulnerable and a sense of exclusion. As Julian said, maybe many academics are a bit kind of, wanting reassurance, but also there's many groups that we're absolutely dependent on, so the part-time research community, part-time workers, who are absolutely key. And so there are large parts of our community that are largely still a bit excluded on the periphery. And many sort of key academics were still saying, we're not quite sure we have much of a say about what our institution is doing and why. Sense of lack of transparency, so a perceived lack of transparency in how decisions were being made, sort of sense of the managerial agenda winning over, and fundamentally a kind of deep-seated concern about what was going on in the sector. So it wasn't really discussed, and having worked in institutions at this time myself, we felt lots of things about how we're going to survive in our little bit of the institution, or as an institution, but not really what does it mean for the sector as a whole. And why pick that particular piece of this research to talk about? I think because it shows at the core a set of, again, Mike mentioned sort of paradox and polarities, a set of tensions that are kind of almost inherent within higher education. So there's tension really between a kind of normative, idealistic set of principles that came out of the origins largely of universities and the monastic tradition, and this kind of more utilitarian kind of business type agenda that was increasingly kind of becoming very visible in our sector. So massive organisations, you take a job as a dean of a school, you've got responsibility for a massive budget, a big requirement. And so I think some of the things we find when we spoke to particularly academic staff, and I must kind of acknowledge that, of course, they're not the only people who make a university, but actually we need to be able to speak across communities and be able to communicate in different ways. So hopefully my work might give some ways of how we can communicate in ways that connect to academic sense of why they might want to leave. Because again, the description of things on Mike's chart, I absolutely agree with everything he says, but you might want to go, well, who on earth would volunteer to put themselves forward for that sort of job? And we know it's very hard to get people into roles of heads of departments and deans and so on, because they are so demanding. And I think one of the main demands and tensions is the need to traverse and balance actually very fundamental different senses of who we are and what we're trying to do. And so then we get to the point of saying, well, what's the role of leadership development community? I think a lot of it is to support people on that identity work and that identity transition of thinking about how can I be a good, credible academic researcher, kind of holding up the normative values side of my organisation, whilst also, working for the overall business aims and taking a view on the kind of more organisational side of higher education. I think it's a side that's often missed. I think coaching is a particularly valuable way of helping people through those transitions. And again, in my own experience, I've not seen it used that much in the institutions where I have, particularly at the point to where people are making that decision as to whether or not to make the jump. By the time you've made that jump, you've taken on the role, you've already done quite a lot of the work that needs to be done and saying, well, how would I be as a dean? How would I be as a professor? And of course, this point, and it's one that I kind of wander about too in my work, is actually there's a kind of resistance almost to the language of leadership. And one of the things in our report, it's summarised in the new report and was talked about in the earlier one, is the sense that people feel that there's a sense within the academic community that maybe the language of leadership has been appropriated around particularly the utilitarian agenda. So when organisations talk about leadership, or they talk about sending people on leadership development or measuring leadership, they're largely looking at measuring organisational indicators. And so this is one of the things that kicks up the resistance. We're going, well, actually, when you speak to people, we say we have these diagrams in those reports called the sailing ship and the sinking ship. When we ask people where they look to for leadership, who they identify as credible leaders, they just in their formation and shaping around their sense of identity and values as an academic. And then people who are involved in kind of putting in place the processes and the tasks and running the institution, they said, well, that's academic management. Again, of course, an old distinction, but it's quite important to understand how people are framing and making sense of this. And then to connect really to, again, back to Mike's talk, was often actually people saying most of the time, actually it's about self-leadership. So as a professional, which many of the people working in our organisations, both on the academic and professional services side too, are saying, how do we find to lead ourselves, to feel a sense of autonomy, I suppose mastery and purpose around what we do, to cite Dan Pink. So what do we do about this? I'll give you this quote, I think, of the sense of what I've talked about. I won't read it out for you. So the challenge is, of course, in our attempts to apply predict and control type approaches to leadership and management, we end up alienating the very people that we actually need to engage. Now we need to step forward and take leadership roles. There is, education generally is a sense of passion, of vocation, commitment to a wide. But many of the ways we measure in kind of performance, appraisal, people and so on, it feels like a question becomes change the nature of that conversation. So we are clearly the reasons why both the normative and the utilitarian side, and how the utilitarian side maybe supports the normative side of our organisation slightly more. And think about classifying and identifying as leadership. So an example in our own work I find quite sort of telling was an example of a junior, quite young female lecturer in an English department in a university who kind of mobilized a bit of a campaign against her colleagues to reinstate the university bookstore that had kind of, rather unfortunately kind of disappeared and been replaced by coffee shops and so on in a redevelopment of the center of the campus. And for her, she was saying, actually, it's really important about the nature of what higher education is about. A bookshop represents, knowledge, the types of work that people do. When you go there and you find the books by people from there, you can find out something about them. So this is exactly the sort of person who should be our future's heads of departments and deans and so on, who are able to articulate a sense of values, a sense of purpose, and to mobilize people behind that cause. Of course, how was she perceived in her own institution? As a bit of a pain in the neck, as someone who's kind of resisting and challenging the kind of corporate view. And I would suggest that that's a missed opportunity. In higher education, you have a lot of people who, their development and training is largely about being critical and maybe reflective and reflexive. How might we bring that more into our management leadership practices and give space to engage that rather than go, well, actually, now you're managing, you can forget, that side and just do, follow the corporate speak. And I think maybe some of the opportunities opened in a VUCA world make that more possible. So to try and summarize the point, so what do academics want from their leaders and managers, and maybe what do those people who are doing it try to often articulate why they're doing it? So these are 5 things that I think are rather important. People generally are looking for how do we develop an enabling environment in which we can do good academic work. So again, in our work, our foundation, we talked about academic work run, or rather only of the institution. How do we create spaces where people can self-lead effectively and not all their time tied up in bureaucracy? But actually, there's a huge value in people who are able to span boundaries within our organizations and beyond them, between academic, professional services, between disciplines, and so on. It's a particularly important space for people to hold, and often that's valued by colleagues, half of us. Acculturation and mentoring. So when we ask people to identify significant leaders or significant people who influence them in their academic career, they often describe these supervisors or their first line manager many times when that was much earlier in their career. So there are kind of key people who play a part in our development, our acculturation, who shape our idea of what it means to be a good academic. And with changing times, we need to think how we might also state that. But these are, the right leadership at the right time. For shared identity. So again, Darren talked about the importance of being seen to champion causes, champion things. We want people who speak up on behalf of us. As a member of a department, I want my head of department to challenge the dean, to challenge the vice chancellor sometimes when they're doing things that I think are counter to the advantages of that. Siloed, also about how we get a bigger picture while we're doing that. But actually, how do we articulate what is meaningful to us? If we give them the time and space, they can also put their head above the parapet and go, what's coming next, and help explain that to us about what might be the implications of, say, for example, VUCA to the way we work. Of course, the problem is that often when we put people into roles of heads of departments, deans, whatever, committees are given spreadsheets to fill out and answer, so they don't have any time left or any energy left to speak to people as human beings. And absolutely, it's fundamentally about human connection, again, as Darren said. So I use the terminology of Peter Gron around constructing a hybrid configuration, because of course none of this can be done by a single individual. It can't even be done probably by a small group of individuals. It's actually done, and it's not always going to be the same individuals doing this for everybody within the organization. So I would encourage you to think systemically in our departments, within our faculties, within our institutions, where are the opportunities and spaces where this can happen? And where are the opportunities and spaces where we can have meaningful conversations about these things that are not always a business agenda? So we can engage and think differently. So plenty more about this if in the reports that we've written. There's copies of the latest one, which I think hopefully is also very much aimed at the development community with some practical tools from colleagues both at Exeter and in Australia. And that's my input. There you go.
As I say, I'm Sue Shepherd, and I'm currently a researcher at the University of Kent, but I'm pretty much sort of steeped in HE. And so I've kind of had a career which has gone the opposite direction for many, in that I was previously a senior professional services director, then became an HE management consultant, did a PhD, and now find myself on the academic front. So I've kind of gone to the dark side, if you like. This morning we've had lots of sort of really interesting expositions and explorations of different aspects of leadership. And I have to say up front, I'm going to take a much more pared down approach, if you like. And really, I'm going to focus in very tightly on the who of leadership. So I'm interested in the profile of our leaders in higher education and what this means, if you like, for future leadership capacity in the sector. So I'm going to look a little bit about the implications of that profile for the future of leadership capacity in the sector. Will we have the leaders we need? Try and answer that question that I pose in my title. And then finally, just highlight a few of the challenges for people like yourselves in the room, staff and organisation and development professionals, of what I've discovered. So, they say a picture tells 1,000 words. Who are these core leadership teams now? Well, as you see, they're pretty much a bunch of men in suits. So, focusing in on deputy and pro vice chancellors, and I do that because they were the focus of my doctoral study, but what you see here is a table, if you like, of who these people are. And on the left, you've got those in pre-92, the old university. And on the right, you've got people from recent data from the Equality Challenge Unit they've just published about the sector as a whole, because I was focusing my research on the old universities. But what you'll see is that, I guess this won't be any surprise to you, that working in the university, see these people, if not on a daily basis, but they're predominantly white, male professors, almost nobody with a declared disability, almost certainly to be 50, 60 something in terms of age profile. And actually, there's not a huge amount of difference between the old university sector and the new, except interestingly on the gender balance. I noticed there's quite a higher proportion of women in those posts in the in the sector as a whole, which suggests post-92s may be actually recruiting more women to these positions, which is quite interesting. So this is looking at deputy and pro vice chancellors. But if you look at other members of that core team, it's a similar picture, certainly in terms of gender balance. Registrars and senior directors, that group within which the director of finance would sit, again, 67, 70% male, and that gets even worse from a female perspective when you get to head of institution level. Across the sector, only 20% of our heads of institution are women, and actually, if you look at old universities, it's even worse than that, it's only 11%. And one of the reasons for this is because you see here that of the deputy and pro vice chancellors I looked at, 90% of them were professors. And when you see that only 22% of professors are women, you can see immediately that you've got a bit of a pipeline issue there that emerges. So I think we could say that it couldn't probably be any less diverse a group than it is at the moment. So let's look forward, let's cast our minds forward to 2020 and see what picture I think might emerge. Well, call me a pessimist if you like, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of change, not based on my research and the trends that I'm seeing in the sector at the moment. So why do I think that might be? Well, because I think fundamentally I would characterise us as having a very exclusionary, is that a word? Anyway, it is a word now, exclusionary approach to making senior appointments. So we start with a bit of professional closure. Now, I know this is more true of the old universities than the new, but nevertheless. So what you say is, okay, let's rule out anybody who's not an academic, to certainly being a deputy and pro-vice-chancellor, and generally a vice-chancellor. There's some honourable exceptions, but certainly in the old university sector, they're the exception rather than the rule. And you do that because you say that the key selection criteria for those jobs is actually a track record of research excellence, or academic credibility is an absolutely core component of that. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's a fact that if you're looking for that, what you're doing is effectively excluding anybody who is not an academic with a research record. And then there's a bit of homo-sociability. I think a tendency very much, and it's not unique to HE, I'm not suggesting that, but of a pattern of people recruiting people who look very much like themselves. So typically, in the case of senior management team, the vice-chancellor is the key mover and shaker, and the vice-chancellor, generally a man, is looking for people with fit to the team. They're looking for people they feel comfortable, understandably, completely understandably, they can work with, they can trust, and they tend to be people who come from a similar background to them. And added to that, so you've ruled out anybody who is not an academic, who's outside HE pretty much. So the next thing that happens, from what I found anyway in my research in old universities, and I do stress that again, is that there's a great conservatism around these. So having ruled out non-academics, then what you do, your next step is you rule out the non-standard academic candidate. And one of the factors for this is that these posts, these senior posts, I think it used to be the case that it didn't matter too much who was PVC. Certainly in the old universities, they do their 3 years and then they'd go away. So if they weren't very good, you could kind of, ignore them a little bit. But those days are gone. We've heard a lot about the new environment higher education finds itself in. These are higher profile, seen as riskier posts, more challenging posts. And it seems as though there's sort of an inverse correlation that the more high risk these posts are seen, and the risk of making a good appointment versus making a bad appointment are seen as quite significant, so the candidates that are appointed become safer and safer. So there seems to be, this fallback to a fixation, if you like, on experience. So rather than looking at people's achievements or their potential, this feeling that you have to have experience. And what better way of showing your experience than to actually be doing the same job already somewhere else? And what I'm finding is that actually facilitated by headhunters who now enable institutions to go out and tap up, to use a footballing analogy, to tap up talented individuals, senior individuals already in posts in other institutions. There's actually a recirculation of these, what I think Glynis Breakwell called a self-perpetuating hierarchy of these increasingly, I would say, career track academic managers. So you've got people moving from post to post, ideally to a bigger and better institution and to a more senior role, but not necessarily so. So there's kind of like a leadership elite, if you like, that's developing. Okay, so what does all that mean in terms of leadership capacity in the sector? Well, as we've heard already, I think arguably the quality of higher education leadership has never been more important. We're living in a very competitive, very challenging, complex environment. But I have to say, I do find it hard to see, based on what I've seen about what's happening now, how we are actually on a road, if you like, to increasing our leadership capacity. No, well, you may argue we don't need to, we're perfectly fine, I don't know. But will we have the leaders that we need? In my view, probably not. And there's a number of sort of key reasons for that, is that I think despite what is arguably a very strong sort of social justice and business case to have more inclusive leadership teams, there's quite a body of evidence emerging now that more inclusive teams actually aid organisational performance. The sector is singularly failing to attract and appoint the best candidates from the widest possible talent pool. And that's down to this sort of exclusionary, very safe, conservative approach. And although the roles themselves, certainly Deputy and Pro Vice-Chancellors I interviewed said that their role is much more managerial, much more demanding than ever before, yet the preparation and the route into the role has largely remained unchanged. So the sort of on-the-job training route, you know, the route that has been described, head of department, dean, PVC, VC, sort of remains the norm. And I think in an environment where Vice-Chancellors told me that they're particularly keen now to, and this is in the old universities again, but I think it's generally been the norm in the post-92 sector that you have external competitions for these posts. But actually, Vice-Chancellors want to bring in people from outside. They want to appoint from outside. They want fresh blood, as they call it. And that's particularly true where the organisation may have a perceived performance issue or where there's a change management agenda in the institution. And let's face it, what Vice-Chancellor is not brought in on a change management agenda? I mean, it's, you know. So that buying in, that desire to buy in talent from outside, I think runs the risk of what one Vice-Chancellor described to me as it being a sticking plaster solution, that you're buying in your talent, a bit like a Premier League football club might buy in footballers from other clubs rather than actually bring people through their own academy. So I think, you know, it could be a potentially quite short-sighted solution to what is perceived to be a leadership development issue. So I leave you just with a few sort of thoughts, and I'm sure these won't be anything new to you, but in terms of staff and organisational development professionals like yourselves, some of these sort of implications or challenges, if you like. Because I did uncover, and I don't suppose it will be news to anybody, that there was quite a bit of scepticism still from Vice-Chancellors and other senior decision makers about the value of training and development, certainly management training and development for these senior members of staff. And I think there's a role for you to play in challenging the assumption that leadership and management skills can be taken for granted in senior academics. Now, I don't mean to be insulting at all to my fellow panelists or any other academics here. I'm not suggesting that academics need not make good managers, but I'm just suggesting that we question the assumption that they automatically do and are good managers, because actually the kind of skill set and promotion criteria for academics, research stars, are very, very different from those that you would need typically for management and leadership positions. And I think that there's a need to ensure that in this world where we do go out and buy talent, that internal staff development and succession management, it came up again, does remain an institutional priority. And I noticed on the Leadership Foundation website only yesterday that a new survey suggests that 88% of HE leaders suggest that their organisation doesn't pay enough attention to actually the internal development of its future leaders. And I think on the professional services manager side, I think there is a job here to look at how the sector can best retain, motivate and get the most out of its ambitious and talented professional services managers, for whom, frankly, progression opportunities within HE are very, very limited. I mean, the registrar role typically is the sort of the role that's at the top of that. But in terms of deputy pro-vice-chancellors, vice-chancellors, in the old universities, and I know it's different in the new, and I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on why that is, are very limited. So how do we retain and motivate, get the most out of those staff? And finally, I think there's a role in arguing the case, if you like, for the development of a more diverse group of future leaders. So not always just focusing programs and initiatives and mentoring on people who are already heads of department and so on, but actually thinking about perhaps people who fall outside what would be the traditional and the standard view of the future leaders. Because I was taken by Darren's phrase this morning. He talked about his championing of diversity because he wanted a more complete organisation. And I think there's a role for the professionals in the room, perhaps, to achieve that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I seem to have abandoned the microphone somewhere, so I'm just going to have to shout. So Angie has given permission on your behalf, so blame her, to run over 10 minutes into the lunch break. So we've got about 20 minutes for question and answers. But before we pose questions to the panellists, and I'm going to get them to move their chairs in a moment, could you just for 2 or 3 minutes around your tables just think about what you've heard from each of these 4 different responses to the overarching challenge, and think about what that does mean in the changing context, and goodness knows what the landscape will look like after the comprehensive spending review and the green paper implementation. But think about what that is going to mean for you and your institutions, and perhaps think about some of the questions that might raise that you can then put back to the panellists. So 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. Right, well that obviously generated quite a big buzz of conversation around your tables. We have Nick at the back with a microphone and Angie at the front, and we're going to have to do a bit of juggling with the panellists as well and questioners, so please be a little bit patient. But would anyone like to start with a question to either an individual member of the panel or the panel generally? Killed the conversation. Linda.
Slightly depressed by Sue's vision of 2020. However, we've come up with some ideas, but just really asking all 4 of you, how would you actually change the nature of leadership in terms of diversity? So in 2020, or maybe even 2025, that we have a slightly better picture.
You'd like to go first?
Well, I'll make a comment drawing on the Frederick Laloux book I mentioned, because that third aspect of future organisations that he identified, wholeness, I think one important dimension of that is diversity. It is having its wholeness both in terms of what we individually bring, but also in terms of being a whole, a representative organisation. And Sue, I think you mentioned the research on organisations that encompass more diversity being more effective and more successful. And that's certainly my experience. So I think there will be almost an external demand that people drive up diversity to be able to prosper in this very challenging environment.
Can I just say, you need people at the back I didn't think could hear, so if you could hold it quite close.
No, it's not picking up on the camera.
Oh,
I think it's a very difficult thing to change in a very short period of time, because we know the timescales are long. Assuming that we're recruiting people with a broad range of diversity, which is the first step, I would take a little bit of issue with one thing, maybe it's not Sue's opinion, but it's research, but I still think when you're appointing people into roles, a degree of experience is still very important, because you need people to do the job. So the question then is, how do you ensure that people who are coming up through different stages of their career have that experience? And that then harks back, I think, to Darren's talk this morning about having an organisation where everyone's running the organisation, everyone's participating. And I suppose that's the way in which I think we have to go forward, is making sure that, thinking is primarily from my point of view about academics, to make sure that those roles, those jobs are shared out, everyone's changing every few years. So you're building up a portfolio of people who have got that experience, and then people shouldn't be being disadvantaged because they haven't got that. But I don't see it as an easy or short-term fix.
I think for me, I would sort of encourage institutions and people making these senior selection decisions to really rethink the job description and the person's spec, and make sure that what they're asking for is actually what is required and is not unnecessarily exclusionary. I mean, I know because I spoke to a number of people who make these decisions, whether they're vice chancellors, I spoke to headhunters, I spoke to people who'd been to a range of interviews, that actually take the old universities, more prestigious universities. What they ask for says as much about how they see themselves as an institution and their culture. And although that's not wrong, I think there has to just be a sort of a balance. You know, is the prime requirement for some of these roles track record of research excellence? And actually what I was finding was, well, that's what we ask for, but actually what we really need is a range of different other management skills and experience. So it's kind of like things going on behind the scenes and people learning to sort of read the runes and interpret these things. And I think that is something that we really just need to sort of look at openly and transparently.
I'll comment quickly because it's important to have other questions, but I think it's an incredibly important question. I think there's a challenge really about what we recognise and reward as leadership and leadership behaviours, and I think there is this challenge around this kind of disavowal of people kind of saying, well, it's not leadership, it's kind of working as part of a team or collaborative. And of course we know from the evidence that there are gender differences between people kind of taking ownership, I suppose, of particular success or at an individual level. And so I think we need to get better as organisations of recognising and rewarding and identifying those capabilities. And back to this point too about identity work and transition, but particularly before you take on the role. Or, so to give people the opportunity to work through, especially when you see everybody who are in those roles don't look anything like you, and not particularly people you'd want to be part of that club often. So how do you begin to give opportunities for people to kind of work through and figure out how they might just be a credible head of department while still being a credible person as well?
Another question.
Hello. I'm wondering whether the Athena Swan programme, up to recently involved with the STEM subjects, has had or has the potential to have an impact on the diversity of leadership.
Enough imbued into Athena Swan to know what that means?
I don't know the direct answer to your question because I don't think that the scheme's been probably running long enough for people to develop into those roles. Certainly in my current institution, we're working very hard to get Athena Swan accreditation, and that's partly because the nature of Bradford as a university hasn't kept up with the rest of the sector probably. There are one or two, I think, very high-profile departments in chemistry, I think particularly, where Athena Swan Silver Awards have been gained, and I think they've certainly become much more inclusive environments for people to work in. But I don't really know whether more women have risen into sort of more leadership positions and then from there further on. So I think it's a very interesting question, and perhaps one that we should be challenging those Athena Swan departments to show the data, because the scheme's been running for a while now, and I guess we should be long enough to see some change. But I think there are some, certainly I think for the academics and researchers in those departments, returning mothers, women researchers, the environments where there's silver and bronze, Athena Swan's very inclusive environments, and certainly pick up people who are very happy working in them. But I don't know about the leadership.
I think that's an interesting one to go back to you, actually, in your institutions and in your conversations over lunch, of what your experience of Athena Swan is and whether you are seeing any difference. But I'm sure that the Equality Challenge Unit will be pressing for those kinds of answers, because obviously clearly they need to demonstrate.
Another very quick comment about that. So another comment about that actually goes back to something I said about disciplines. So currently I run an engineering faculty which has very few women academics in it, and it has very few female students. So part of my mission is to try and increase women who want to come and do engineering and computer science, for example. But that's something that's more embedded in our society, I think. So that's a big part of the university where female students are not there and women academics aren't there. So it's broader than that.
Hello, my name's Michelle and I'm from the University of Westminster with a number of other colleagues here. Thank you for your speeches. I'm particularly interested to ask Julian, because a number of questions came up about mentoring and nurturing homegrown talent, but Julian mentioned about mentoring outside at different departments, different universities and institutions. Have you also brought about mentoring schemes within and dealt with homegrown talents as well, nurturing homegrown talents? And because I'm taking part in a work-based learning scheme, I'd like to know what that looks like.
I think I might have misled you a bit. That the mentoring I was talking about was all within the same faculty, but outside of the sub-departments. I think the issue about mentoring outside of the university, that does happen, I think, probably for people in the more senior leadership groups, where you actually want someone outside of if you're So, for example, I have a mentor who's outside of my university so that I can have a frank and open conversation with them. I think the mentoring is really important. One of the challenges I had, I think we all had in this room, is actually finding people who know what it is to be a mentor and actually can be, reflective and allow people to talk and think. So I think there's a challenge there, not just for the academics who we want to mentor, but for training mentors to work with mentees and knowing the difference. I think it's a really powerful tool, and it certainly goes back to how you develop an organisation to be empowered, because I don't use the nudge cards that Darren talked about, but I will routinely, if people come to me with a problem, ask them how they would solve it. But I'm only one person doing that, so I think that's a way in which we can go forward. But I don't know of any formal cross-university mentoring sort of things that go on. Sorry.
Mike, you're known as Mike the Mentor, so
Not to this one, no.
Do any of you have experience of between institution coaching or mentoring activity in your regions?
We're running an initiative at the moment with Newcastle. We're running an Liz Camp, Newcastle University. So we've partnered up with Durham University for women in academia coaching and mentoring. So that's for professors to build a network primarily, but they have maybe 3-day sessions to learn coaching and mentoring skills. And the idea then is that they go on and mentor less senior women from the institutions. Currently we're focusing on mentoring women from our own institutions, but we certainly have looked to mentor across the institutions when the time feels right. So that's something that has been working quite effectively.
I think we've got time for just one more question, if anyone. Yes, Emily.
Oh, thank you. I'm quite a reflector, so I find these things quite challenging to come up with a question that is really engaging and stimulating. So I'm sorry if it's a bit rambly. I was struck by, Richard, the quote that you used with the female senior or principal lecturer around kind of we are engaged, but maybe not with the university. And some of the things you were talking about around language and the language between kind of how perhaps myself as somebody who works in the professional service side and how I view the university and the use of the word the business versus an academic and kind of where their passions are and kind of what really stimulates them to do what they do and to continue to do it really, really well. And I guess, I'm sorry I'm rambling everyone, I know you want lunch. It's around kind of, did you pick up through the conversations that you had, through the research that you've done, kind of ways where you've seen people in professional services in roles like ours, where we have done that communication piece really, really well? So you've got your engaged academics, and then kind of how do we, in the roles that we're in, how do we support these really, important colleagues of ours that we actually are in a business to help them do the best that they can and be the best that they can be?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think there's an important point really about where we look to for leadership and externally. So we're still looking at some of this data actually too, and we find that particularly people who identify strongly with a research identity particularly will identify people from outside of their own institution, often from earlier in their career, as the most significant influential people. And it's slightly different for those who identify more strongly with teaching and administration. So that's kind of interesting in its own right. I think one of the things it opens up is the possibility to think of, well, where are all the leadership development opportunities that you have in your external roles? So as a member of an editorial board of a journal or on a ref panel or somewhere else, there's lots of opportunities for us to develop the skills that would be useful as a head of department that I think are often not really actively engaged and embraced in institutions. I think one of the things that development community can do is to recognise in a way this slightly kind of schizophrenic sort of identity, that you may identify more with people from your own academic discipline than in another part of your own institution. I find myself all the time calling people colleagues who are from a different institution, somewhere else, who are not part of it, in ways that I might not feel with people who are in a different bit of the same institution. I think really, how do you kind of get around that? I think it's beginning to say, how do we create opportunities for us to come together with professional services staff to feel a sense of shared endeavour? Because so often we structure our organisations both physically and psychologically in ways that makes it a them and us. And so, of course, professional services go, them academics, they don't do what we want to do. We go, them professional services. I mean, I've experienced it myself in my own role. So when I first started working at the University of Exeter at that time, I worked in a room where I was shared a physical space with a lot of people who were effectively professional services, and we were all working exactly on the same task, really about developing this area of the organisation and delivering programmes and so on. And, you develop personal relationships with them. And, over a period of time, particularly to do with organisational restructuring and kind of, getting people together, you increasingly found a physical separation of academic and professional services staff, and I know it's happening in other institutions as well, to points where you never see each other than, those points when it falls down, where you kind of... And I think even where we situate people, so often, the answer to leadership is go and send them on a leadership training course, or, whatever. I think a lot of it is actually saying, just think where people are, and where they can actually get opportunity to go, actually, you know what, they're okay. And part of that is explaining our rationale, and kind of being open to the other side. I mean, so, I don't know, it's a bit of a rambling answer to your rambling question, but I think, there's a lot of ways we might think about how we structure and position and what we do, that actually, are we exaggerating these, and building the wall even higher, such that of course we don't collaborate and I don't identify. What would be the opportunities to kind of shift or make different sorts of spaces where we can engage, or intellectual spaces as much physical spaces where we can engage as people in a shared endeavour. And I think there are pockets of where that is. Quite how you roll it out as practice, I don't know, but.
I think we're going to have to draw it to a close now, and I'm sure people are keen to have lunch, and it's a bit warm in here as well. So, but can I ask you to thank the panellists very much?